As someone who's been in the real estate industry for over 20 years now, finding seller leads and closing more deals is not nearly as difficult as you think it is. Let me explain. Right now, there's a couple sitting in their home in your market who's going to sell in the next several months, and they're actually just sitting down to have their morning coffee. They haven't called an agent yet, they haven't filled out any forms online, but everything about their situation says it's coming. Now, wouldn't it be nice to know that ahead of time? And of course, almost every agent's going to miss that because they're all crammed into the same thought process, chasing expireds, maybe some FSBOs, maybe hitting up a random email to their sphere of influence in their CRM. Maybe they'll call back some of those old leads they have sitting in their inbox. For years, I missed them as well. I was in the same situation, guessing, hoping, throwing outreach to anyone with a pulse, and making sure I wore my badge at the grocery store. Then I found out how much the data could actually tell me about the owner before I even reached out. And I'm not talking about a list of names. I could see that they owned that big 2-story home for 28 years. The kids were grown, they were sitting on a mountain of equity, and that told me a lot about where they were in life and the likelihood of them being receptive to having a conversation with me was much greater. You see, that's the second part of MAP. It's called problem. And it's how I stopped using the same tired strategies as everyone else and started proactively finding homeowners that nobody else was even looking for. So persona, which is the first part of MAP, is understanding who I was built to serve. Problem, which is the next step, is finding exactly where those people are and understanding very clearly what they may be going through. Problem is really the most practical step because persona was the idea, right? The idea of who it is I was going to serve, who I was most equipped to serve. Problem is where I really get into the data and get very specific about who those people are and preparing to reach out to them with a very specific message based on all the context that I have about them. So what we're talking about in this very important step is that we're connecting data to humanity. And it has to be in that order. The data helps me find them, but it's my experience that tells me what it all means. So let me show you exactly how I go about finding that couple. And by the way, this example of the couple that I mentioned is exactly what I used to do when I first moved here to Florida and decided to focus on what I believe was a very likely scenario in this part of the country. Just in my head, I was envisioning this older couple living in a larger home that would have a higher likelihood of wanting to downsize. So what did I do specifically? I stacked a thoughtful group of filters where I looked for senior owners, long ownership history. They've lived in a large 2-story home because we know 2-story homes can sometimes become a problem as we get older. And I also threw in there high equity into the mix as well. Now, any of those filters on their own isn't necessarily strong enough. The power of this strategy really is when we focus and compound or stack them on top of each other. So you can imagine going through this exercise increases the likelihood of conversation, right? And listen, this is just one example, right? This same approach works no matter who you're choosing to serve. So say the person you're focused on serving is people going through divorce. I'd look for recently filed divorce records because many times those parties need to or want to sell a joint house. And many times there's a court-driven timeline forcing the sale. So just on that alone, that's a highly motivated seller with a clear deadline. And I'm able to find those before the house is ever listed. Or let's talk about tired landlords. Everybody thinks the signal there is just owning a rental. It's not. The signal is the owner who's actually just worn out. So in that case, I'm looking for absentee owners that are maybe out of state with a long ownership history. And then depending on the size of the resulting list, I may go a little bit deeper and look for code violations or tax delinquency, because what does that tell me? That's not a landlord who's thriving with their investment. That's a landlord that's potentially done, right? And is likely one bad tenant away from selling. And they rarely need a pitch. They just need someone to hand them that exit strategy or pre-foreclosure. And this one's super interesting because most agents just wait for the public filing and then start competing against each other to reach that seller. And those poor homeowners get buried under a pile of letters, voicemails, and phone calls. And what I do instead is get ahead of everyone. Before that public filing even happens, I'm looking for signals like propensity towards default. In other words, likelihood of default, because all the data is available and tells me so. And then I can choose to combine that with tax delinquent status. And on top of that, I could also stack on absentee ownership, because an absentee owner, of course, is going to have less emotional attachment to that property and is just more likely to just want out. This puts me in a much stronger position because I'm the only one having that conversation weeks or potentially months before anyone else even knows there's a conversation to have. And notice with all of these and what they have in common, none of them are dependent on what the market is doing. A divorced, tired landlord, someone falling behind on payments, or an older couple that finds themselves in a home that's just too big, those are all life changes that happen in a hot market or a cold market. And that's precisely why I stopped waiting on the market to hand me a deal and started going and finding the people I already knew I could help. So let's go back to that older couple for a moment, the one I mentioned at the start, because finding that specific data is only one part. The very next important piece is combining it with my experience and not forgetting to overlay the human element. What I understood over the years about serving this type of customer was that the move was never about square footage. It was about all the memories of closing one chapter, of raising a family, and the excitement and promise of what could come next in her life. And if I'm honest, what most of them really wanted was just to have life be a little lighter, less commitment to the property, and more time for family, friends, and travel. And for a lot of them, that meant just this little condo on the ocean. And this part of understanding is something the data can't hand you. This combination is the very edge that you have, and something I really came to appreciate about doing it this way. When you buy a lead from a service, you have no control over who's on the other end. You're just reacting. But when I build the list myself from stacked signals, I control the whole narrative and knew the situation before I ever made contact. I was walking in already understanding where they were in their life and how I might be able to help, right? What I didn't realize at the time was doing it this way was also creating a side benefit I just couldn't have anticipated. And that was that I became known as the person who could very skillfully help others in that same situation. And that created a fountain of inbound opportunities. So once I learned how to identify them and could clearly understand their situation, the only thing left was to understand how to reach them. What could I say specifically to earn their trust and earn their business? And what were the best channels to do that in? So that's problem. And it's how I learned to stop guessing and start knowing very specifically. The data showed me who was likely in the situation I was best equipped to serve. And my own experience told me not only what they were going through, but how to handle it best. If you've got any questions, please make sure to drop them in the comments. I do read them all, and it helps me create more content like this to serve you better. And remember, if this content makes sense to you, please consider subscribing, because I'm committed to sharing what actually worked for me and for the agents I've had the pleasure and privilege of serving across the country, which means it's likely to help you as well. Now, finding the right people only paid off for me once I figured out how to reach them and what to say specifically. And early on, my mistake was I sounded just as generic as everybody else. So I'll show you how to fix that in the last part of MAP. It's called Plan, and it's the next video right here. We'll see you in the next one.